New York's dazzling face was adorned with sparkling stores and towering massive shopping malls. However, every light cast a shadow, and Alan was one of those living in the shadows. Despite graduating with honours from university and being a promising engineer, he had been unable to find a job. Life had not treated him fairly. He had to work as a security guard to take care of his sick mother, pay the bills, and survive. The time spent patrolling at night, thinking about his dreams, was his greatest escape. In one of New York's most famous shopping malls, there was a shadow that went unnoticed by those shopping in luxury. Yet Alan deserved much more with his intelligence and hard work. However, the world saw him not for his talents, but only for the uniform he wore. He was invisible in the glittering world of the wealthy, but that did not mean he had lost his conscience. At night, while looking at the silhouette reflected in the mall's windows, he would remember the dreams he carried inside. Sometimes he would watch the people standing in front of those massive displays. Dressed in expensive clothes, they seemed to belong to another world, far removed from the realities of life. But for Alan, life was about fighting and standing up for what is right, beyond the luxurious displays. The sense of justice he carried within him was stronger than any wealth could buy. Life had been harsh on him, but he had never compromised his honesty and integrity, and that made him much more than an ordinary security guard. Some evenings, while completing his security rounds, he would look at his silhouette reflected in the large glass displays. The engineer inside him, the man searching for solutions to problems, was still there. But no one saw this identity. Unlike the bright lights and flashy displays around him, his life was simpler and more modest. He was searching for an exit to find his own path, perhaps a small opportunity or a moment that would change his life. But most of all, he was waiting for a moment to prove his worth, to make a difference not just as a security guard but as a human being. That night the shopping mall was about to close. As Alan patrolled, a strange unease filled him. The air was cold, and the silence echoing through the corridors carried a tension like that before a storm. Wandering in a quiet and dull environment for long hours sometimes relaxed his mind. But tonight was different. His eyes had adjusted to the dim lights of the mall, but the feeling of unease within him did not fade. It was as if a shadow was accompanying him, an unseen but felt danger. His senses were on high alert, and his heart was racing. He took a deep breath and continued to move forward, carefully observing his surroundings. His instincts told him that something was wrong. Trusting his instincts, he turned towards a corridor that felt abandoned and eerie, one he had rarely visited. In the unsettling silence of the air, something felt amiss, as if an invisible threat was hiding there. Just then, a scream echoed, piercing the silence of the darkness. Suddenly, his hair stood on end, and his pulse quickened. Without hesitation, propelled by a surge of adrenaline, he ran towards the sound. What he saw horrified Alan. A young girl was cornered, trembling with tears in her eyes, looking around in desperation. In front of her stood Richard Stoneman, the spoiled and arrogant son of one of New York's most powerful businessmen. Alan knew exactly who he was. He had grown up in the shadow of his wealth, knowing no boundaries, believing himself untouchable. The threatening expression in Richard's eyes only fueled Alan's anger. When Richard noticed Alan's presence, a smug smile spread across his face. He scrutinized Alan from head to toe and curled his lips in a dismissive manner. "Who do you think you are? This is not your job. Get out of my way," he said, not bothering to hide the mocking tone in his voice. But Alan's anger was growing like flames rising within him. His eyes darkened and his breath quickened. Stepping forward with a voice that trembled with power, he thundered, "Leave this girl alone right now!" A mocking smile appeared on Richard's lips. "Do you really think you can stop me? You're just a security guard. My family is one of the most powerful in New York. You can't touch me because I am untouchable." However, Richard was mistaken. Alan might be a security guard, but he was also someone who did not hesitate to be the voice of justice. The determination in his eyes for the first time unsettled Richard. In a swift motion, Alan pushed Richard against the wall. People like, "You think they can buy power with money, but the true cost of justice is courage," he hissed. Richard winced, and the arrogance in his eyes was replaced by fear. The young girl seized the opportunity and quickly escaped to call the police. Within minutes, patrols flooded into the shopping mall. Richard, as usual, thought he would escape relying on his father's power, but this time things were different. Security cameras had recorded every moment, and with the girl's testimony, Richard had no way to escape. People surrounded the scene, trying to understand what was happening. Alan, with his courage, had saved a woman's life and perhaps prevented a greater injustice. But for him, this was not about heroism, it was about doing the right thing. As the camera's light shone on his face, Alan thought to himself, "If I could be the voice of justice tonight, that is enough." However, the outcome of this event was not just being hailed as a hero. The identity of the young girl remained a great mystery. She had thanked him and said a few words, but then she had vanished. For days, the events of that night replayed in his mind. The fear in her eyes, her trembling voice, and the uncertainty that followed. Alan could not shake off the impact of that moment. Who was that girl? Why didn't she come back? His desire to learn her identity was not just curiosity. It was a deep-seated wish to protect her and know how she was doing. A few days later, a young and elegant woman came to the mall where Alan worked. Her simple yet stylish clothes suggested that she was someone confident but not showy. There was gratitude in her eyes, along with a hint of shyness. She approached Alan, took a deep breath and smiled gently. "I must thank you," she said in a soft voice. "You saved my life that night. If it weren't for you, who knows what would have happened?" For a moment, Alan caught the depth in her eyes. This was not just a thank you. It was a reflection of admiration and trust towards him. Alan smiled slightly, warmth appearing in his eyes. "It's nothing. I did what being human requires." The woman paused for a moment. Her eyes wandered over Alan's face, then she lowered her head slightly and said, "I'm Isabella." Her voice was low and hesitant, but she did not say her last name. It was as if she felt that hiding her identity was necessary to preserve the purity of this moment with Alan. Isabella was actually a member of one of New York's most powerful families. Her father had noticed Alan's courage and wanted to hire him in his company. However, for Isabella, that was not enough. Isabella wanted to truly know if Alan was someone who acted based on his values, not just for money or status. To measure the sincerity of Alan's character, she decided to hide her identity and explore his world. Isabella continued to engage in friendly conversations with Alan. As days passed, their bond grew stronger. One day, Isabella invited Alan to go out together. Alan was initially surprised but eventually accepted. For them, it was not just a dinner, but an opportunity to get to know each other better. First, Alan took her to tour the neighbourhood where he grew up. The streets were narrow and impoverished, but the people were friendly. There were familiar faces in the small shops where he greeted people. Isabella noticed how much Alan was loved and respected here. Even in poverty, there was warmth. This was very different from the grand mansions she had grown up in. Later, Alan took Isabella to a movie theatre. It was not a luxurious cinema, but an old one where ordinary people went. Alan bought the tickets, but Isabella was a bit surprised as it was her first time watching a movie in such a place. During the film, when Isabella felt cold, Alan took off his jacket and quietly handed it to her. Isabella felt something stir within her at this simple yet heartfelt gesture. After the movie, they took the subway. While Alan stood in the crowded train, he found a seat for Isabella and made her sit down. Isabella observed his thoughtfulness and kindness. Alan may not have had wealth, but his sincerity and character made him more valuable than anything. When they reached the beach, Alan sat on the sand and gazed up at the sky. The stars were as endless as the ocean waves. "Here, I escape from everything," he said with a slight smile. "Sometimes life feels so complicated, But when I come here, I remember how vast the universe is. I realise how small my troubles actually are." Isabella was lost in his words. She had never met a man who could think so simply yet so deeply. Alan's perspective on life was very different from the world she knew. In that moment, she couldn't fully express what she was feeling. She just lowered her head and continued to gaze at the stars. Isabella remained silent in response to his words. What she saw in Alan's eyes was that happiness was not related to money. Despite going through tough times, he found the beautiful sides of life. This was something Isabella had never considered. Alan felt something in Isabella's deep gaze, but he couldn't quite understand it. He didn't know who she was, yet he was becoming more attached to her with each passing day. One day, Alan found himself waiting for Isabella at the door after work. There was an unusual seriousness on Isabella's face, as if she was struggling, with a storm growing inside her. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. Alan noticed the hesitation in her eyes. "I actually have wanted to tell you the truth for a long time, but I didn't know how." Just then, a car approached from a distance to pick up Isabella. Alan watched in shock as the driver opened the door. A luxurious black car slowly came to a stop, and a cool chauffeur in formal attire got out. The man waited respectfully but distantly for Isabella to get out. Many questions arose in Alan's mind. Isabella was not who he thought she was. Was there another reality hidden behind her humble demeanour? As Alan pondered his feelings, he sensed hesitation in Isabella's eyes as well. This moment was a turning point for both of them. Alan's brows furrowed slightly, and his voice turned almost to a whisper as he asked, Are you really wealthy?" Isabella took a deep breath. She looked at Alan without averting her gaze. "I am Isabella St. Clair. My father is one of the biggest businessmen in New York. But I am not just his daughter. I am someone trying to find my own path." Alan fell silent for a moment. His heart raced. A storm was brewing inside him. On one side was the trust he felt for Isabella, and on the other was the doubt that arose suddenly with this revelation. Could he really trust her? Or was this part of a game played on him from the beginning? He fixed his gaze on Isabella's face, searching for a sign, a hint of sincerity. Isabella continued without breaking eye contact. "At first, I tested you because I know how people generally view money. I wanted to see if you were different, but over time I realised that you are not only someone who fights for justice, but also a truly honest and sincere person. That is why I am telling you everything openly." Alan remained silent for a while. He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on Isabella's. Finally, with a slight smile, he said, "If this is a test, I hope to not just pass, but to get the highest score." Isabella smiled back. With a glimmer in her eyes, she whispered, "I have never felt this strongly before." That night, storms raged in Isabella's mind. Alan's world was so different from the lavish life she knew. But perhaps true warmth, sincerity, and peace were hidden right here. Alan's unwavering stance, honesty, and attachment to life deepened. Isabella's admiration for him with each passing moment. She felt safer and more at peace with him than ever before. Yet a voice inside her still asked questions. Which world did she truly belong to? The turmoil within her grew. On one side was the world filled with the wealth and privileges she was accustomed to, and on the other was Alan's humble yet authentic life. For Isabella, this was no longer just a process of getting to know someone. It was a journey of transformation. That night, two people from different worlds began to truly feel each other. As Isabella saw the world Alan lived in, her admiration for him grew. Her respect for his struggle, sincerity, and humanity strengthened her feelings even more. Alan also realised that Isabella was not just the daughter of a wealthy family. She was someone genuinely trying to understand. He saw the purity, curiosity, and perhaps a fragility in her that he had not noticed before. Slowly, the bond between them began to transcend words. They shared moments where they understood each other just through their gazes, without touching. They discovered the truth that a bond coming from the depths of the heart was stronger than wealth or status. Love sometimes sprouts in the most unexpected places, and the deepest loves grow not only in the shadow of justice, but also in the light of sincerity and authenticity.